Hello everybody and welcome back to Tech Art for All. I'm really glad that you're back and that I'm really hoping that you're finding these videos to be extremely useful and that you're having a great time and you know I always say if there's frustrations, definitely contact me and hopefully it's just minor issues that I can help you solve pretty quickly. Um, I wanted to say that I'm really happy that I'm able to bring you these lessons for free. I think there's a lot of great educational content on the internet. This is one of the best things about the internet. Great videos. I've certainly learned a whole lot from YouTube videos. Whenever there's some kind of issue or I want to know how to do something, I go to YouTube and quickly search for something, and sure enough, there's a lot of great content. So thank you for all the people and to YouTube for making having the giving us the ability to find useful information and learn. And I think uh, if you have some kind of knowledge, don't hoard it. Share it with people. I think it's one of the most satisfying things that you can do. So let's get started. Today actually might be a longer lesson, a longer video, not just because of my spiel in the beginning, but because we're finally going to go over for loops. And it's kind of, besides all the different commands, it's kind of one of the biggest components of scripting and just programming in general. So last lesson we talked about if statements, and if you remember, you can think of them as kind of like the gates um, at which you ask a certain question, and then if it's true or false, depending on what the criteria is, it either runs or doesn't run the block that belongs to the if statement. So that was pretty exciting. And today we're going to go over for loops. And for loops, they're there in order to simplify the code. A lot of times you want to iterate through hundreds or thousands of objects, and you want to kind of do the same bit of code over and over again. And instead of writing 100 or 1,000 lines of code for the specific objects that you want to change, you write it once, and then the for loop iterates through the objects and lets you apply the same code or the same change to all the nodes. But as you start scripting, you'll see how useful it is and how it's a part of almost every script that you write. So I'm going to start out by creating an array, a string array of names. So I'm going to comment string array of names, and type string names. Make sure it's the two square brackets denote that it's an array, and then let's populate it with some names. Let's see. Let me think of a good name. Okay, Richard, that's a good name. Bella. Jacob. Oops, forgot the quotes. Jacob. Philip. Alex. Adriana. Okay, that's good enough. That's enough names. So we got this array. Let's execute it. By the way, I was telling it to execute. You press the bottom right elongated enter button that's next to the num key. You can also right click and say execute. And it doesn't like something. Let's see. Invalid declaration of variable names. Oh, okay. I remember what it is. I've already played around a little bit inside of this Maya. So what we're going to do is we're going to call this. So this variable already exists. So that's why. Excuse me. Bless me. Let's call it list of names instead. And that worked. So yeah, so what happened was I already played around in this Maya, and once you create a variable inside of the script editor, it then cannot be, until you restart Maya, it cannot be redeclared as a different type. So that's why I got that first error, but let's ignore that. So the first thing we're going to look at is a for in loop. It's a very simple loop, but it's very powerful. You're going to end up using it all the time. It's mainly used to just straight up iterate through items in a list. Let's say you have a list and you definitely want to do something to all the items in the list. This is the best way to do it. Okay, I'm going to call this the for in loop. Okay, this is what it looks like. I'm going to create, so because I'm iterating through a string array, I have to use a regular string variable to populate one name at a time. So every time it goes through the loop, it just kind of switches over to the next name. So I'm going to call, and you'll see what I mean in a second if that's a little bit confusing. I'm going to call this name and then in list of names. And now I have open and closed squirrely bracket. Once again, I don't know exactly what those brackets, if there's an official term for them. If you do know what the term is, please let me know and I'll be more than happy to use it in the future. Open squirrely bracket, closed squirrely bracket, and inside, this is the block inside of which we put the code that we want to execute for each loop. So the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to simply print the name. I'm going to go print name. So what this should do is it should, go through the first iteration of the loop and it will get Richard, and it will get Richard from the array and put it inside of the name variable, and then it will print name. And then during the next iteration of the loop, it will switch over to the next item, which is Bella. We'll put Bella into name, print name, and so on. And it will just power through all of the items in the list. It's smart enough to automatically populate the item. It's smart enough to know which item you're on and how many there are total. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another print statement. And this one is just going to be a \n. And what \n is, it's a special character that's, consists of two characters. So the backslash is a special character that tells the mel that the next character will mean something special. It's not just n. So \n means new line. So we can actually comment that out and see what it looks like without the \n print statement. Let's run all of this. And you can see that it just typed, let me actually maximize this. You can see that it just typed everything in one line. And then if I comment out print \n, it added that new line character so that each item in the array, each string gets its own line. So it's much cleaner that way. Okay, so this is great. So the other thing we can do is if we want to keep count of things inside this loop, we can create a counter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say int counter equals 0. So this is just a regular int variable, and I'm going to initialize it to 0, which is, kind of like the default state. And then I'm going to say print the actually I'm going to say item number counter. I'll explain in a second what I'm doing here. This is called the string concatenation. It's a strange word and I have a hard time pronouncing it. Okay, so basically what I'm saying is I'm doing another print statement, and it's going to print item number, and then when you add the plus sign and a variable, it will add the contents of that variable to the string, and you can kind of continue doing it as long as, for as long as you want. I mean, you might reach some kind of limit, but it takes a lot of text. So basically, hopefully now, instead of just getting a list of names, it will say item number 0 is Richard. Item number 1 is Bella. And the other thing I have to do is actually, I have to make sure that counter is growing with every loop. So I'm going to take counter. I'm going to say counter equals counter plus 1. So basically, it's going to run the first time. It'll say, counter is equal to 0, because that's what I initialized it to, and it will say item number 0 is, and it'll print name, Richard, new line character, go to next line, and then before it starts the next loop, it will increment counter by 1. So you'll get, so counter becomes 1, and then during the next loop, counter becomes 2, and so on and so on. So let's see what happens if I print it now. Aha, error. This is actually great because, you know, errors happen. And let's figure it out together. It says that there's a syntax error. Oh, I know what the syntax error is. The syntax error is that I have to put, when you're combining variables and strings together, you have to put parentheses around the item, and it's kind of like the encapsulation that makes sure that everything is added together correctly. Let's run it again. Okay, so this time it worked. Now you can see that item number 0 is Richard. Item number 1 is Bella. Item number 2 is Jacob, and so on. So one thing to remember is that in arrays, the first element is actually element number 0. So this is something that takes a little bit of time to get used to, but you know, you'll catch on pretty quickly. So this is called the for in loop. The next type of loop is a little bit more complicated. I'm not sure what to call it. I'm going to call it another for, or more complicated for loop. I'm sure there's an official name for it. If you know what it is, definitely let me know. So the way it works is you say for, and then you declare an integer. I think you'll find that usually people use $i, and then you declare it to 0. And then you put semicolon. It's a very special kind of syntax. You just have to remember how it works. And then the next portion of it is kind of like an if statement. It's a test to see if a specific comparison is true. And you can say, so basically you can say like, every time it loops, it will check if your I, which is the counter, is less than the number of items inside the array. So, and bear with me for a moment, you'll see how it works. So I'm going to do the if statement test. I is less than, I'm going to say size of, I'm going to copy list of names. Oops, list of names. And then you do I plus I plus plus. And inside there, we can start out with the same code that we had in the previous for loop, but we'll make some modifications. Okay, so what is this doing? When the array, or sorry, when the for loop first gets going, it runs this portion once, where it initializes the I, which is the same thing as the counter up here. It's just called I. It's called something different. Let me clear this really quick so it's not disruptive. So the first time it initializes the I to 0, and then it starts looping through the array. And basically, first thing it does is it goes, hey, is I, which in the first loop is 0, less than the size of items inside of list of names. So for example, if I run this command by itself, which you can do, it's a mel command, it should give me 6. So it's telling me that there's 6 items inside the list. So every time it's going to check. If you don't want to check every time, a little bit optimized way is to, because the size hopefully won't change in this case. Well, it definitely won't in this case, and you might have cases where it does change, but that becomes, it could be really, really messy, and I wouldn't suggest doing that. But you can get the size into a variable beforehand. So you can say int size. So this is something new. These little quotes, and they're not quite quotes. They're a special character that's under the tilde, which is right under the escape button on normal keyboards. So you'll see the little squiggly thing, and then underneath it is like a diagonal single quote. So that um, that helps you. It it you use those at the end and the beginning of a command in order to capture the return of the command or the output of the command and send it back to the variable. So basically, if I run this without these single quotes, you get an error. Oh, actually, you don't get an error because of the way I'm running this command. As you can see, I put it inside of parentheses. If I didn't use parentheses, which most examples of mel commands don't have, let me see. You get an error, right? So you'll see that most commands are executed in this fashion, and you just put the little squiggly line, not squiggly, diagonal quote character, and now it captured the result and put it inside of the variable. So the other way you could run it is by putting parentheses around the command, and then you don't need the squiggly lines. I'm not sure why there's two different ways of running the command, and why one, needs the single quotes and the other doesn't. But just just as a lesson for you, that's how it is. Okay, so now I've captured the size, and I'm going, instead of capturing the size of the list because that size doesn't change, I already captured it, and I'm just gonna reuse this variable. So basically, it's gonna be running for the first time. I'm going to initialize I. This only happens once in the beginning. I becomes 0. Then it tests, is I less than size, which is 6 in this case. Let me clear that. Which is 6 in this case. Yes, it is. What is going on here? So I0, 0 is less than 6. Run this code. It runs the code. I don't need the counter because the counter is part of the for loop now. And instead of counter, I'm going to use I. Okay, so 0 is less than 6. Run this code. Print item number blah 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 is. Print the name. Print new line character. Then, after it's done running the commands inside of the for loop block, it does this. And some of you probably don't know what I++ is. I++ is exactly the same as this. All it's saying is that, hey, just take I and increase it by 1. So it's just kind of like a shorthand version of this. I could also do I plus equals 1. That's also the same thing. It's just, I'm showing you different ways of doing the same thing, but just you'll notice most of the time it's I++. So now it went to I++, which makes I 1. Okay, so this after the first loop, this no longer gets executed. So now I is 1. Hey, is 1 less than 6? Yes, it is. Execute this block. I++, I becomes 2. Is 2 less than 6? Yes, it is. Execute the block, then increment again, and so on and so on. And at some point, I will become 6, and then asks, is 6 less than 6? No, it's not, and it's over. So at that point, the for loop stops looping. So let's clear the output, and let's run the command. Aha, it worked. Or did it? No, it did not. And the reason is because I forgot to update. I hope you can see this. I forgot to update the name. The name variable is no longer getting repopulated. So what I have to do is I have to grab list of names. But then I have to, on each loop I have to tell it which item in the list of names array do I want to print. And the way I do that is I just put I in there. So because in the beginning I is 0, so we'll print the 0th, which is Richard. The next loop it's 1, we'll print the number 1, which is Bella, and so on and so on. And now, when we print it, it's correct. 0 is Richard, 1 is Bella, 2 is Jacob. So these two are doing similar things, but you'll find that there's cases when this for loop becomes more useful. For example, if you don't want to just increment by 1, if you want to loop to every other item in the list. This for loop is super simple, and it's useful for just like going through every item in the list. And then this one, you can customize it a lot more and do some clever things with it. And I think as you start using it or seeing examples of it, you'll start, having these moments where you realize like, oh wow, that's really cool. So just know that. And so the last loop is called while loop. And the way that looks is like this. While, and basically inside of here you put some kind of test, kind of like also an if statement that checks if something is true. So this one is checking while something is true. So for example, I'm gonna say print Richard. Actually, you know what? I'm gonna print the same stuff as above. I'm just gonna show you how to do it with a while loop. One thing I should tell you, or give you like a bit of warning, is it's all too easy to create a loop that never, especially not so much with this guy, not for the in loop, but these two loops. It's very easy to create an infinite loop, and an infinite loop is a loop where the test that checks to see if the loop is done never reaches a test that's true, and so it just keeps going and going and going and going. Or maybe you have so many items in the list, and each time for each item it takes such a long time to process that you could be looking at days, and you're just like, oh man, I don't have days to write the script. If you run into an infinite loop or a loop that just takes a long time to process, you're kind of stuck. You have you have no choice but to shut down Maya, unless you want to wait for days or hours or whatever. So I highly recommend that especially when you're learning, but even if you're not learning, happens to me all the time. Whenever you're prototyping inside of the script editor, make sure to copy the code and put it in some kind of external text editor as often as possible, because once you run into the loop, you lose everything, and then it's really frustrating. You're going to be super frustrated, especially if you have a lot of cool stuff that you're just like super proud of. I've had moments like that where I run something and I'm like, it's for some reason not stopping. It keeps going and going and going, and then of course I realize I've done something bad, and it's looping forever or a really long time, and then I cry for a little bit, but then I make the decision to close my eye and just start over. But I've gotten better at it. Once you have those situations a couple of times, you start realizing how important it is to copy and paste into a text editor. So definitely remember to do that. And I also promise that you'll still run into those situations where you want to cry. So while loop, let's kind of try to get the same output, but inside of a while loop. And what we're going to do is, this time we're going to once again create a counter. I'm just going to copy and paste. Create a counter, it's 0, and then I'm going to say while, and then we're also going to get the size of the array again. So you'll see that it's very similar, but slightly different. And then I'm going to say while counter is less than size. And then in here, I'm going to make sure to increment the counter. That's pretty important. If I don't increment the counter is going to always be less, infinite loop, and we're done. So this is kind of like the saver for me right now. And we're going to do the print statement. I'm going to grab this one. Here, I'm going to say print item number counter, because we're using counter again. And instead of name, once again, I'm going to get list of names So I'm going to grab it directly from the array, and I'm going to use the counter variable to grab the names that are corresponding to the counter value, and then print it, and that should work. Let's see. I'm going to clear history. Great, that worked. So once again, it says item number 0 is Richard, 1 is Bella, and so on and so on. So let's go through this again. I created an int variable that's called counter. I initialized it to 0, so that's like the starting point. I'm going to get the size of the list of names array, so how many items are in this list, and there's 6 names, so it will return 6 inside of size. And the loop starts, and it says, hey, okay, I'm looping for the first time. Is counter less than size, which is, is 0 less than 6? Yes, it is. Run the code, and at the end, counter becomes incremented by 1, and we can go back to that plus plus instead if you guys want. So counter gets incremented by 1. Now counter is 1. Okay, is 1 less than 6? Yes, it is. Do the thing. Is 2 less than 6? Do the thing. Is 3 less than 6? Do the thing. Is 4 less than 6? Do the thing. Is 5 less than 6? Yes. Is 6 less than 6? No, it's not. I'm done. And it just comes out of the loop and continues your code. And by the way, I don't know if I mentioned this before, but code 99.9% of the time gets executed in the order from top to bottom. You're going to run into potential cases where it doesn't get executed in the right order, and I'll show you those situations and how to get around them. And then usually, yeah, you just got to remember that it gets executed top to bottom and then left to right. And and when I say left to right, I'm talking about like chunks of code. So like if I type this and then this again, I'm not talking about items inside each of the kind of like segments. I'm talking about the segments themselves. They get executed left to right. So this will get executed first. Sorry, this will get executed first, and then this, and then this, and this, and so on. So that's just a good thing to know. Everything should happen in order. And like I said before, there are some cases when it doesn't, and that's frustrating because you expect it to go in a certain order. So those are the 3 different while loops that we went through. We also talked about how to get output from a command. So in this case, size, we got output and we put it inside of the size variable. Don't forget there's 2 ways to do that. In fact, most of the time, it's going to be like this. So these are identical. This will get the output and put in the variable, and so will this. 2 different ways, and most of the time you're going to be doing it this way. So yeah, those are loops. Like I said, your scripts are going to be made up of variables, commands, loops, and if statements. And I know this is just the beginning and I'm going over kind of like the simplified versions of each, but those are the building blocks of scripts. And once you get comfortable with those, with practice and time, you're going to see how simple all this stuff is. And the hard part is actually figuring out like how you want to attack the problem, like what's the plan, right? And then of course, if you get bugs or some kind of unexpected issues, those are tough as well. Or infinite loops, those suck. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and next time we're gonna start writing an actual program, and we're gonna open up a scene with some objects and we'll do some things with them, and it's gonna be a lot of fun. Thanks for joining me today, and have a nice day.